Asheville, North Carolina, December 1895. Snow falls across the Blue Ridge Mountains, settling on a structure that should not exist in these hills. 4 acres under one roof. A French Renaissance château impossibly detailed, rising from American wilderness like a fever dream made stone. The numbers are staggering before you even step inside. 175,000 square feet of living space, 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor swimming pool when most Americans still hauled water from wells, central heating, electricity, refrigeration, technology that belonged in cities, not mountains. The cost? Estimates vary, but construction consumed somewhere between $5 and $6 million, well over $150 million in today's money. More than 1,000 workers at peak construction, 6 years to build what one man envisioned as a retreat from the world, a sanctuary, a statement, the largest private residence ever constructed in the United States. But here's the question that haunts every corridor, every marble staircase, every hand-carved ceiling. What do you build when you have everything except the one thing you actually want? When your family name means power, but you yourself feel powerless? When you're the youngest, the sickest, the one nobody expected to matter, and you know it? George Washington Vanderbilt II built Biltmore. And the deeper you look, the more you realize this house was never about showing wealth. It was about hiding weakness, about creating a world where being fragile in a dynasty built on ruthlessness wouldn't destroy you, where you could breathe without explaining why you needed so much space to do it. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. The story starts where all Vanderbilt stories start, with one man and a ferry. Let's go back, not to Biltmore, but to where the money came from, because you cannot understand the mansion without understanding the machine that paid for it. His name appeared on no masthead, commanded no fleet, ran no railroad. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born in 1862, the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt, the richest man in America. That inheritance, wealth beyond measure, was supposed to mean freedom. It meant the opposite. His older brothers were groomed for empire. Cornelius II took the family's railroad interests. William Kissam took the family's social ambitions. Frederick took his own path into gentleman farming. George, the youngest, the one with weak lungs and a quiet temperament, took what was left: books, art, languages, the margins of the Vanderbilt machine. By his 20s, George spoke 8 languages fluently. He collected rare books with the precision of a scholar. He traveled Europe studying architecture, agriculture, forestry, subjects that meant nothing to the men actually running American industry. The family indulged him the way wealthy families indulge members they don't quite know what to do with. He was educated, cultured, refined. Also, irrelevant. Understand what that position meant in the 1880s. The Vanderbilt fortune began with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, a man who built shipping and railroad monopolies through ruthlessness that made other robber barons seem gentle. He consolidated power by crushing competitors. He accumulated wealth by paying workers as little as possible and charging customers as much as the market would bear. He died in 1877 worth roughly $100 million, about $2.4 billion today, and left almost all of it to one son, William Henry, George's father. William Henry doubled the fortune in 8 years. Railroads, real estate, strategic investments that compounded wealth at rates that defied comprehension. When he died in 1885, his estate was valued at around $200 million, roughly $5 billion in today's money. The will divided the fortune, but not equally. George received roughly $10 million outright, plus trust funds generating income. It was a fortune by any measure. It was also a reminder: you are provided for, you are not essential. Being weak in a dynasty built on power teaches you things. It teaches you to find spaces where different rules apply, where strength isn't measured in railroad miles or stock portfolios, where you can build something that matters without competing in arenas where you'll always lose. George found that space in the mountains of North Carolina, and what he built there was magnificent and impossible and ultimately unsustainable. But first, you have to understand why he needed it. The wound was not a single event, it was accumulation. Every family dinner where brothers discussed business, George didn't run. Every society event where men measured worth and deals closed, markets cornered, competitors destroyed. Every moment of being William Henry Vanderbilt's son, but not the son who mattered. His health made it worse. Respiratory problems plagued him from childhood. His lungs were weak, not dangerously so, but enough that extended time in New York's coal smoke-choked air left him exhausted. Doctors recommended mountain air, dry climates, places where he could breathe without constant inflammation. It was medical advice. It was also exile. And then there was the social performance he was born into but never quite mastered. The Vanderbilts were new money trying to become old money. They built mansions on Fifth Avenue to prove they belonged among the Astors and the Livingstons. They married European aristocrats to buy titles and legitimacy. They threw balls that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime to prove they understood taste. George understood taste. He had studied it, cultivated it, developed genuine appreciation for art and architecture and literature. But he understood it the way a scholar understands a subject, with knowledge, not with the effortless command of someone born to it. He could identify a Renaissance painting's provenance. He could not work a room the way his brother William Kissam could. He knew the rules. He did not enjoy the game. So, when his father died in 1885 and George inherited his fortune, he faced a choice. He could stay in New York and play the role expected of him, lesser Vanderbilt, attending functions, managing investments, existing in the shadow of more dynamic brothers. Or he could leave. He chose to leave, but not to escape exactly, to build, to create a place where the values he actually cared about, beauty, knowledge, careful stewardship, could matter more than the values that dominated the world he was born into. In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina. The mountains were beautiful. The air was clear. The climate was gentle. Land was cheap, and the region was undeveloped enough that he could shape it according to his vision, rather than adapting to existing social structures where he'd always be compared to more powerful men. He began buying land, thousands of acres surrounding the small resort town of Asheville. He hired the most prestigious landscape architect in America, Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park. He hired the most talented young architect he could find, Richard Morris Hunt, who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and understood European aristocratic architecture. What George asked them to create was specific: a French Renaissance château in the style of the Loire Valley castles he'd studied during his European travels. Not because French architecture was fashionable in America, though it was becoming so, but because those castles represented something he wanted. They were seats of learning, culture, refinement, built for families who valued art and scholarship alongside power. Hunt designed a structure that combined the elegance of Chateau de Blois with the scale of American ambition. Limestone, Indiana limestone for the exterior, carved with the precision of Renaissance artisans. A footprint measuring 780 feet from end to end. A roofline of copper and slate that would oxidize to green over time. A building designed to look like it had stood for centuries, even though it was being carved from modern materials. Olmsted planned grounds that would transform exhausted farmland into designed landscape. Forests replanted according to scientific forestry principles, gardens laid out in classical European style, roads and paths winding through the estate to create the illusion of natural beauty while demonstrating complete human control. The vision was precise, the cost would be extraordinary, and George had the money to make it real. In 1889, construction began, and with it began the transformation of one man's personal wound into 175,000 square feet of carefully designed refuge. The house rose from the mountains, room by room, stone by stone, carried on the backs of workers whose names history mostly forgot. Construction began with surveying, engineers mapping the site, determining where bedrock could support the massive foundation, calculating drainage and grade. The location Hunt selected was strategic, a gentle rise overlooking the French Broad River, with views of the Blue Ridge Mountains stretching in multiple directions. Before the first stone was laid, Olmsted's team began transforming the land. The property George had assembled encompassed roughly 125,000 acres, about 195 square miles of North Carolina countryside. Much of it was depleted farmland, forests logged bare, soil eroded from decades of farming practices that extracted without replenishing. Olmsted saw it as a vast restoration project. His plan was ambitious: replant the forests using scientific forestry principles that were still relatively new in America. Hire a professional forester, eventually Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Create a working forest that produced timber sustainably while also serving as the scenic backdrop for the estate. Lay out gardens immediately around the house, but let the larger landscape appear natural even as every aspect was carefully managed. While Olmsted's workers planted trees and cut roads through the property, Hunt's team began the château. Foundation work started in 1889. The structure required deep foundations to support the weight, millions of pounds of limestone, marble, brick, and steel. Steam-powered equipment hauled materials to the site. Narrow-gauge railways built specifically for construction carried stone from the railroad depot to the building site. The workforce peaked at over 1,000 men. Stonemasons, many brought from Europe, carved the Indiana limestone that formed the exterior. Bricklayers constructed the internal walls. Carpenters framed the wood elements. Plasterers created the ornate ceilings. Ironworkers forged the decorative metalwork. Electricians installed wiring for the electric lighting system, a luxury in 1890 that most American cities didn't yet have. Materials came from everywhere: limestone from Indiana, marble from Italy, oak paneling from European forests, tapestries and furniture purchased from European estates and dealers. George didn't just want a new building, he wanted a structure that felt like it had history, weight, legitimacy earned through time.
The construction pace was relentless. Hunt pushed for completion by Christmas 1895. George wanted to host his first Christmas at Biltmore that year. Workers operated in shifts. In summer, they began at dawn to avoid the afternoon heat. In winter, they worked through cold that made handling stone painful. Injuries were common: falls, crushed hands, respiratory problems from stone dust. The technology integrated into the house was cutting edge: central heating via coal-fired boilers that circulated hot water through pipes running throughout the structure, electric lighting powered by a generator on the property. Most of America still used gas or oil lamps. Indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water in dozens of bathrooms, refrigeration in the basement kitchens, a dumbwaiter system to move food from the basement kitchens up to the dining room, telephones connecting different wings of the house. By 1895, the château was largely complete: 175,000 square feet of living space, approximately 16,000 square feet in the basement alone, containing kitchens, storage, servants' quarters, mechanical systems. The first floor held the public rooms: entrance hall with 70-foot ceiling, library holding 10,000 books, banquet hall with triple fireplace, billiard room, breakfast room. The second floor, family bedrooms, guest rooms, sitting rooms. The third floor, more guest rooms and bachelor quarters. The fourth floor, storage and observatory. Hunt had created something that had never existed in America: a fully realized French chateau, complete and functional, dropped into the Appalachian Mountains. George had spent somewhere between $5 and $6 million, over $150 million today, and 6 years of continuous work. On Christmas Eve 1895, the house was ready. George invited family and close friends for the first Christmas at Biltmore. They arrived by train to Asheville, then traveled by carriage the final 3 miles to the estate. The approach was designed to impress. The road wound through forests Olmsted's workers had planted, past landscaped grounds until finally the chateau came into view, massive, ornate, impossibly detailed. The performance began, and for a brief moment, it worked.
Inside, the house was a study in controlled magnificence. Every room demonstrated wealth, yes, but also George's specific vision of what wealth should buy: beauty, knowledge, comfort engineered to appear effortless. The entrance hall set the tone, 70 feet from floor to ceiling, walls of Indiana limestone, a grand staircase carved from oak and embellished with carved acorns and other forest motifs, Flemish tapestries on the walls, a massive triple fireplace, the ceiling a barrel vault with hand-painted decoration. Stand in that space and you felt the weight of what George had created, not just expense, but ambition to create something that would last, that would matter. The library held 10,000 volumes, 2 stories of books on topics George had spent his life studying: architecture, agriculture, history, literature in 8 languages, a carved walnut ceiling, black marble fireplace, comfortable chairs positioned near windows overlooking the mountains. This was the room that revealed George's actual interests, not parties or society, but reading, learning, the accumulation of knowledge. The banquet hall could seat 64 guests at a table that stretched nearly the length of the room. Triple fireplace at one end, large enough to roast an entire ox. Flemish tapestries depicting scenes from the life of Romulus and Remus. Oak paneling. Organ pipes built into the wall. The house had a fully functional pipe organ. Above the fireplace, the Vanderbilt family motto carved in stone: Dum vivimus, vivamus. While we live, let us live. The breakfast room, smaller and more intimate, demonstrated George's attention to comfort. Round table for casual meals, wood paneling in lighter tones, large windows flooding the space with natural light, the ceiling painted with scenes of Venice. This was where the family actually ate most meals, not the formal banquet hall. Guest bedrooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors were each individually decorated, many named for their color schemes or furnishings: the Tyrolean chimney room, the Claude room, the Sheraton room, the Chippendale room. Each had its own bathroom, a luxury almost unheard of in the 1890s, when most houses, even wealthy houses, shared bathing facilities. The basement was where function dominated. Industrial-scale kitchens with massive coal-fired ranges, sinks the size of bathtubs, storage rooms for provisions, a swimming pool, indoor, heated, tiled, bowling alley, servants' dining hall, mechanical rooms housing the boilers, generators, and other systems that made the house function. And then the servants' quarters, small rooms, simply furnished, clustered near the working areas of the house. The staff lived where they worked, available whenever needed. Their world intersected with the family's world only when service demanded it. Christmas 1895 was George's proof of concept. The house worked, the systems functioned, the beauty impressed. Family members who had perhaps questioned whether George's mountain retreat was worth the expense walked through rooms that justified every dollar. This wasn't eccentricity, this was achievement. But beneath the celebration, mathematics waited. Operating Biltmore required staff, a lot of staff, and staff required wages, food, management. The mechanical systems required fuel, maintenance, expertise. The gardens required gardeners. The forests required foresters. The house itself required constant care, cleaning, repairs, heating in winter, cooling in summer. George had built his sanctuary. Now he had to keep it running. And running Biltmore cost more than most people could imagine. Daily operations at Biltmore followed patterns established in European country estates, but adapted to American circumstances and George's specific vision. The house wasn't just a residence, it was an enterprise. The estate employed, at various points, between 40 and 80 full-time staff, depending on season and whether guests were in residence. Some lived on the property, others lived in Biltmore Village, the model workers' community Olmsted designed adjacent to the estate. The hierarchy was European in structure.
At the top, estate manager, who oversaw the entire operation. Below that, house steward, who managed the indoor staff. Housekeeper, who supervised the female servants. Butler, who oversaw dining service and the male house servants. Head gardener, who managed the landscaping and greenhouse staff. Forest manager, who supervised the working forest. Farm manager, who ran the dairy and other agricultural operations George established. Beneath these management positions came the workers. Housemaids, who cleaned the public rooms and guest bedrooms. Ladies' maids, who served the female guests. Valets, who served the male guests. Footmen, who served table and assisted with various household tasks. Cooks and kitchen staff. Laundry staff. Stable hands, who maintained the horses and carriages. Groundskeepers. Laborers. What George had created required constant human attention. The house had 65 fireplaces. In winter, all needed to be lit, fed throughout the day, cleaned of ash. The boilers burned tons of coal each month. Someone had to shovel that coal. The elaborate gardens required daily maintenance. The dairy produced milk and butter for the household. Someone milked the cows. The vegetables came from the estate gardens. Someone planted, weeded, harvested. Guests arrived regularly. George's mother visited frequently. His brothers came with their families. Friends from New York and Europe. Artists and intellectuals George collected the way his brothers collected yachts and racehorses. When guests came, the staff level increased. Extra housemaids, extra kitchen staff. The service had to be perfect, not because George demanded it out of vanity, but because perfect service was what people expected at a Vanderbilt property.
The working forest was George's particular pride. Gifford Pinchot and later Carl Schenck managed approximately 125,000 acres using forestry principles that were revolutionary in America at the time. They didn't just harvest timber. They conducted the first scientific forestry experiments in the United States, proving that forests could be managed sustainably, harvested for profit while also regenerating. The Biltmore Forest School, founded by Schenck in 1898, trained America's first generation of professional foresters. The estate also operated a dairy farm, producing milk, butter, and cream for the household and for sale to Asheville residents. Vegetable gardens, orchards, a massive greenhouse complex growing flowers year-round, exotic plants, fruit trees that couldn't survive outdoors in North Carolina. George didn't just want self-sufficiency, he wanted demonstration of modern agricultural and forestry methods. Monthly operating costs varied but were substantial. Wages alone likely ran to several $1,000s per month. Coal and other fuel, food for staff and family, maintenance and repairs, property taxes, new plantings for the gardens, equipment for the forestry operation. The exact figures are difficult to pin down because George kept detailed records, but they're scattered across different accounting categories. One estimate, possibly conservative, annual operating costs hovered around $250,000 to $300,000, roughly $7 to $9 million in today's money, every year, just to keep the house running, the grounds maintained, the staff paid. George's inheritance generated income. His initial inheritance of roughly $10 million, invested conservatively, probably produced around $500,000 annually in income, enough to cover operations with money left for reinvestment, as long as nothing changed. For the first decade, nothing did change. George lived at Biltmore, managing his forests, building his library, hosting guests who appreciated the refined culture he'd created. In 1898, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, who shared his interests in literature and the arts. In 1900, their daughter Cornelia was born at Biltmore. The house filled with life. The forests matured. The systems worked. The vision was real. And beneath it all, the mathematics remained stable. Income exceeded expenses. The estate was sustainable. But sustainability required that everything stay the same, that George's investments performed consistently, that no unexpected costs emerged, that the world around Biltmore remained stable. The world did not remain stable, and when it shifted, the house that George built to be his refuge became something else entirely. 5:30 in the morning, even earlier in winter. The house had to be fully awake and functioning before George or any guests opened their eyes.
This was non-negotiable. The performance required preparation. The housemaids woke first. Young women, mostly local girls from Asheville and surrounding areas, hired into service at Biltmore. They dressed in dark uniforms, black or dark blue dresses, white aprons, white caps. Their quarters in the basement were simple. Small rooms, basic furnishings, shared washrooms. Nothing elaborate. These were sleeping spaces for people who spent most waking hours elsewhere. Their first task, the fireplaces. Biltmore had 65 of them. In winter, the main public rooms and bedrooms needed fires lit before anyone woke. The maids moved through the house in near darkness, carrying coal scuttles, kindling, matches. Light the fire. Clean yesterday's ash from the grate. Lay fresh coals. Move to the next room. The work was dirty, physically demanding, and had to be completed before the family stirred. Simultaneously, the kitchen staff woke. The coal ranges in the basement kitchen required early lighting. The massive iron structures needed time to heat before cooking could begin. The head cook and assistants moved through pre-dawn preparation, lighting ranges, heating water for tea and coffee, beginning bread making, preparing breakfast service. By 6:30 a.m., the house was warming. Fires burned in dozens of rooms. The kitchens hummed with activity. The boiler system circulated hot water through the pipes Hunt had designed into the walls. Biltmore had central heating, which was advanced for 1895, but the fireplaces were still lit for ambiance and additional warmth in the largest spaces. Housemaids then moved to cleaning. Dust accumulated constantly. The house was enormous, filled with textiles and carved wood and surfaces that required daily attention. They dusted furniture, swept floors, maintained the public rooms to perfection. If guests were in residence, they also serviced the guest bedrooms, made beds, emptied chamber pots. Even though Biltmore had modern plumbing, some rooms still had chamber pots as backup, refreshed water pitchers, tidied personal items. The architecture of service was deliberate. Hunt designed separate circulation systems for family and staff. Service staircases, narrow and utilitarian, hidden behind walls and in corners. Service corridors running through the basement and connecting different wings. Staff moved through these arteries unseen. A guest walking from the library to the banquet hall never saw a housemaid unless that maid was actively performing service in a public room. The basement was the working heart. Stretching approximately 16,000 square feet beneath the château, it contained everything required to make luxury appear effortless. Industrial kitchens with massive ranges, sinks, preparation tables. Storage rooms for dry goods, canned goods, wine. The servants' dining hall where staff ate meals. Plain food, nothing like what was served upstairs. Laundry facilities with industrial washing equipment. Mechanical rooms housing boilers and generators. Staff quarters. The swimming pool and bowling alley, technically for recreation, but used infrequently by staff, who were mostly exhausted from work. The staff hierarchy was rigid. The estate manager and house steward occupied positions of authority, making decisions about operations, hiring, discipline. The butler controlled dining service with military precision. The housekeeper supervised all female staff and enforced standards that were exacting. Uniforms maintained perfectly, behavior above reproach, efficiency without visible hurry. Below them came the service staff themselves. Ladies' maids attended to female guests, helping them dress, maintaining their clothes, arranging hair, providing personal service. Valets performed the same functions for male guests. Footmen served at table, answered doors, carried messages, assisted with various household needs. Housemaids cleaned and maintained the rooms. Kitchen staff cooked. Laundry staff washed and ironed endless loads of linens, clothes, table linens. Stable hands maintained horses and carriages. At the bottom, scullery maids and the youngest workers. Scullery maids did the dirtiest kitchen work, washing dishes, scrubbing pots, cleaning the floors and ranges. The work destroyed hands, left them raw and cracked from constant water and harsh soap. Young men served as hall boys, running errands, carrying luggage, performing manual labor. The bell system connected upstairs to downstairs. Each major room had a bell pull. When someone pulled it, a wire ran through the walls to the basement where a corresponding bell jangled in the servants' corridor. Each bell had a distinct tone. Experienced staff could identify which room was calling by sound. When a bell rang, someone responded immediately. The family and their guests did not wait. Wages varied by position and were recorded in household ledgers. A head housemaid in the 1890s earned roughly $15 to $20 per month plus room and board. A scullery maid earned about $8 to $12 per month. The butler earned closer to $50 to $60 per month. Kitchen staff earned between $15 and $30 depending on skill. Laundry staff, groundskeepers, stable hands earned similar ranges. For the period, these were competitive wages. George paid reasonably well by contemporary standards, better than many estates in the South. The work was exhausting, the hours long, but employment at Biltmore was considered desirable. The house was new, well-maintained, not yet falling into the disrepair that plagued older estates. The management was professional. The expectations were high, but not capricious. Yet context matters. George Vanderbilt routinely spent thousands of dollars on a single artwork or piece of furniture. The annual wage bill for the entire household staff, 40 to 80 people, probably came to roughly $15,000 to $20,000, accounting for all positions and seasonal variations. George spent comparable amounts on individual purchases for the house. The servants understood this. They knew the value of the tapestries they dusted, the paintings they walked past, the furniture they maintained. They knew George Vanderbilt's fortune was measured in millions, while their wages were measured in dollars per month. Most accepted this as the natural order. Wealth and service existed in relationship, had always existed in relationship. Some felt pride in working at one of America's grandest estates. Some felt gratitude for reliable employment. Some felt resentment they could not voice. What they actually thought is only partly visible. Few written records survive from the servants themselves. No diaries, few letters, occasional mentions in household records when someone was hired or dismissed. The historical record privileges the employers, not the employed. We know George paid them. We know their job descriptions. We don't know their private thoughts about the arrangement. A few patterns emerge from what little evidence exists. Turnover was relatively low in senior positions. Butlers and housekeepers who performed well kept their positions for years. Turnover was higher in junior positions. Housemaids and scullery maids often left after a few years, usually to marry or find other work. No evidence suggests widespread cruelty or abuse. Also, no evidence suggests the staff felt anything approaching equality with the family they served. A gentle employer is still an employer. Kindness from a position of total control is still control. George Vanderbilt, by all accounts, treated his staff with respect and paid them fairly by the standards of his era. He was not a tyrant. He was also a man who commanded a household where dozens of people existed primarily to make his life comfortable, beautiful, and efficient. The work was real. The exhaustion was real. The power imbalance was real. And the house could not function without them. Every fire lit, every meal served, every room cleaned, every guest attended to. All of it depended on people whose names appear only intermittently in the historical record and whose compensation represented a fraction of the wealth they helped display. They built the beauty with their hands. They maintained it with their bodies. They made the performance possible. And when the performance ended, as it eventually would, their choices would narrow even further. When guests arrived at Biltmore, the choreography of service began. The approach was visible. Carriages coming up the winding drive Olmsted designed, past the forests and gardens, until the château emerged. Staff watched from windows. Preparations accelerated. Footmen stationed at the entrance waited to greet. As carriages stopped, they moved forward to open doors, assist guests disembarking, unload luggage. The butler appeared in the entrance hall to welcome guests formally. Ladies' maids and valets were assigned to specific guests, ready to unpack luggage and provide personal service throughout the stay. The entrance hall created immediate impact. That 70-foot ceiling, the massive fireplace, the oak staircase, the tapestries. Guests absorbed the scale while footmen carried luggage upstairs to assigned bedrooms. Each guest room was prepared in advance, fires lit, fresh flowers arranged, water pitchers filled, beds turned down. When guests reached their rooms, everything was ready. Meals followed patterns George established. Breakfast was relatively informal, served in the breakfast room. Guests could come when they wished within reasonable hours. The staff laid out a buffet: breads, pastries, fruit, eggs, bacon, coffee, tea. The informality was deliberate. George wanted morning meals to feel relaxed. Luncheon was more structured, usually served in the breakfast room or, in good weather, outdoors. The menu was lighter but still elaborate: multiple courses, wines selected from the estate's cellar. Dinner was the main performance, served in the banquet hall when large groups gathered. 7 to 9 courses, formal dress required. The table set with china, crystal, silver, dozens of pieces per place setting. The service choreographed. Footmen entered in sequence, serving from the left, removing from the right, synchronizing movements so all guests were served simultaneously. George hosted regularly, but not constantly. His mother visited often, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor Vanderbilt, the Mrs. Vanderbilt of New York society, though by the 1890s her influence was waning. His brothers came with their families, friends from his New York circle, artists and writers whose company George preferred to purely social acquaintances. He collected interesting people the way he collected books. The guests George preferred were often intellectuals and creatives, artists working on commissions, writers researching books, architects he admired, people who could discuss forestry, agriculture, literature, art, topics George actually cared about. The house parties weren't primarily about status display, though status was certainly displayed. They were about creating an environment where conversations George valued could happen. Between visits, life at Biltmore was quieter. George managed his estates, the working forest operations, the agricultural experiments, the household accounts. He read in his library. He rode horses through the property. He corresponded with foresters and architects. He lived the life he designed for himself, removed from New York's social warfare, engaged in work he found meaningful, surrounded by beauty he'd created. Edith, his wife, managed the social aspects George had never mastered naturally. She planned guest lists, menus, activities. She corresponded with potential visitors. She navigated the social expectations that came with being a Vanderbilt, while George focused on the forests and library. Their daughter, Cornelia, born in 1900, grew up in a house filled with art, books, and carefully managed beauty. The estate operated as a complete system. The dairy provided milk and butter, the gardens provided vegetables, the forests provided timber for sale and for estate use. The greenhouses produced flowers year-round. George's vision was partial self-sufficiency combined with demonstration of scientific modern methods. Revenue from the working forest helped offset some operating costs, though it never came close to covering the full expense of maintaining Biltmore. Timber sales brought in income, the dairy sold products to Asheville. But the house itself was not a profit center and was never intended to be. It was a residence, a retreat, a statement about what wealth should support. The years from 1895 to 1914 were Biltmore's peak. The house functioned as designed, the forests matured, the systems worked. George lived the life he'd built. The vision was real, sustainable as long as conditions remained stable. Those conditions did not remain stable. War came, taxes changed, the economics that made estates like Biltmore possible shifted fundamentally. And George, who had built his sanctuary to escape the pressures of the world, discovered the world reached even here. But before the crisis, there were years of relative peace, years when the house worked, when the staff knew their roles, when guests arrived and departed and the performance continued, when George could believe that what he'd built would last. The belief was reasonable. The house was solid, built to endure centuries. The fortune was vast, carefully invested. The vision was clear. Why wouldn't it last?
The mathematics that supported Biltmore were always precarious, though they didn't appear that way. George inherited roughly $10 million, invested conservatively in railroad stocks, government bonds, and other traditional vehicles. That capital generated approximately $500,000 annually in income, roughly $15 million per year in today's terms. Annual operating costs for Biltmore ran somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. Staff wages, fuel, maintenance, food, property taxes, forestry operations, agricultural expenses, household supplies, everything required to keep the estate functioning. That left $200,000 to $250,000 annually for personal living expenses, purchases for the house, reinvestment, and contingencies. It worked, as long as nothing changed. But things did change. In 1914, Europe went to war. World War I disrupted global markets, shifted capital flows, created uncertainty in investments that had seemed stable. George's portfolio, like most portfolios of wealthy Americans, took losses. Not catastrophic losses, but meaningful ones. Income declined. Simultaneously, costs increased. Coal prices rose as war production consumed fuel. Labor became more expensive as men left for military service and demand for workers increased. Property taxes crept upward as local governments sought revenue. Then, in 1916, something more fundamental shifted. The federal income tax, established in 1913 but initially mild, began to increase. The war demanded revenue. Congress raised rates dramatically. By 1918, the top marginal rate hit 77% on income over $1 million. George's income was in that range. His after-tax income fell sharply. The squeeze accelerated. Revenue down, costs up, taxes dramatically higher. The comfortable surplus that had made Biltmore sustainable narrowed, then disappeared. George began drawing on capital to cover operating costs. And then, in March 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died unexpectedly. He was 51 years old. The cause was complications from an appendectomy, routine surgery that went wrong. He died in Washington, D.C., far from the home he'd spent 25 years building. His death transferred the problem to Edith. At 43 years old, she inherited an estate worth millions in assets, but requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to operate. She also inherited a 13-year-old daughter, Cornelia, who was George's sole direct heir. Edith Vanderbilt was intelligent, capable, socially skilled in ways George never was. She understood immediately that the economic model supporting Biltmore was broken. The income no longer covered costs. The capital was substantial but not infinite. Drawing it down to cover operations meant eventually running out. She consulted lawyers, accountants, advisors. They confirmed what she already knew. Something had to change. The options were limited and all involved loss. She could liquidate everything. Sell the house, sell the land, sell the collections, convert everything to cash and live comfortably in a smaller way. Many advisors urged this. The estate was worth millions. Selling while the market was still relatively strong made financial sense. She could drastically reduce operations, close wings of the house, dismiss most of the staff, sell portions of the land, keep the core but abandon the grand vision. Or she could find a way to make the estate generate revenue sufficient to cover its own costs. Transform it from a private residence consuming wealth into an enterprise producing wealth. Edith chose the third option, but implementing it required sacrifice on a scale George never imagined when he built his sanctuary. The first major sale came in 1915. Edith sold approximately 87,000 acres of the Biltmore Estate to the federal government for $5 per acre, roughly $435,000 total, about $12 million in today's money.
The land became part of what is now Pisgah National Forest. This was not simply a financial transaction. It was Edith dismantling part of George's vision. Those 87,000 acres were forests George and his foresters had managed, replanted, nurtured. They were demonstration grounds for scientific forestry, experiments in sustainability. They were integral to the estate as George conceived it. But Edith needed cash. The sale provided immediate capital to cover operating costs and gave her time to develop longer-term solutions. It also reduced the property tax burden. Fewer acres meant lower taxes. She cut staff. Not drastically at first, but systematically. Positions that became vacant weren't refilled. Seasonal workers weren't hired. The dairy operations scaled back. The agricultural operations reduced. The staff level dropped from peaks of 80 to perhaps 40 or 50. Every person dismissed saved wages, but also reduced capacity. The house itself stayed open, but changed character. Edith and Cornelia still lived there, but the elaborate entertaining decreased. Fewer guests, smaller gatherings, the banquet hall used less frequently. The performance scaled back because the resources to support full performance weren't available. The 1920s brought new pressures. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, complicated entertaining, though private estates like Biltmore could maintain wine cellars stocked before the law took effect. The broader cultural shift away from Gilded Age excess continued. Large estates seemed increasingly anachronistic. Maintaining them seemed wasteful as attitudes toward wealth and display shifted. Edith managed carefully. She maintained the core. The house stayed in good repair. The essential staff remained employed. The most valuable collections stayed intact. But the abundance that characterized George's era was gone. Everything tightened. In 1924, Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat. They lived at Biltmore for a time, attempting to maintain the estate as a family home. 2 sons were born, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil in 1925 and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil in 1928. For a moment, it seemed possible that the next generation might continue living in the house George built. But the arithmetic remained unforgiving. Even reduced operations cost more than the estate generated. The family fortune, still substantial, continued to erode. In 1930, Cornelia and her husband moved to England. Edith remained at Biltmore, increasingly alone in a house designed for dozens of people. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, made everything worse. Investment income plummeted. Markets collapsed. Wealth that had seemed secure evaporated. Families across America lost everything. The Vanderbilts didn't lose everything. Their fortune was too diversified, too vast, but they lost enough that maintaining Biltmore became impossible under the old model. Edith faced the same choice again: liquidate or transform. In 1930, she made the decision that saved Biltmore but ended George's vision. She began opening the house to paying visitors. The estate that George built to escape the world, to create privacy and beauty away from public performance, became a tourist attraction. The public rooms opened for tours. Admission was charged. Guides led visitors through the entrance hall, the library, the banquet hall, explaining the tapestries and paintings and carved ceilings. The transformation was radical. What had been private became public. What had been refuge became performance again, but a different kind of performance, not social display for elite peers, but commercial entertainment for middle-class tourists. The house that was supposed to demonstrate what wealth could create at its best became a museum of what wealth had created. It worked financially. Tourism revenue helped cover operating costs. Not entirely, the house still required subsidies from the family, but enough to make continuation possible, enough to prevent liquidation. But what survived was not what George built. The vision was gone. The careful forestry experiments ended. The elaborate social life evaporated. The staff reduced to skeleton crews maintaining only the public spaces. The house became a shell of its original purpose, preserved but transformed. Edith lived at Biltmore until her death in 1958. She never remarried after George's death in 1914. She spent 44 years managing the estate he created, first trying to maintain his vision, then trying to save what could be saved. She succeeded in preservation. She could not succeed in continuation. When Edith died, ownership passed to Cornelia's sons. They faced the same challenges their grandmother faced, but with even less family capital to draw upon. The estate could not function as a private residence. The only viable option was full commercialization. In the decades since, Biltmore has become one of America's most popular tourist attractions. Over 1 million visitors per year, a hotel built on the property, a winery producing wines sold under the Biltmore name, restaurants, shops, events. The estate generates substantial revenue and operates profitably. The house is preserved beautifully. The collections are maintained. The architecture endures. Tours are educational and respectful. The current management treats George's creation with care. But it is not what he built. He built a private sanctuary. What survived is a public museum. He built a place where beauty and knowledge could exist apart from commercial considerations. What survived is a commercial enterprise selling access to beauty and knowledge. The transformation was necessary. Without it, Biltmore would have been sold, subdivided, possibly demolished. The house survived because it became something else. But what survived is not the vision. It's the evidence of the vision.
Stand in the entrance hall today. Look up at that 70-foot ceiling, the limestone walls, the carved oak staircase, the Flemish tapestries. Everything George placed there remains. Everything looks as it looked when guests arrived on Christmas 1895. But the silence is different. When George lived there, the house was quiet but alive, staff moving through service corridors, fires burning in dozens of rooms, the hum of occupation. Now the silence is museum silence, carefully preserved emptiness. The question George asked with his architecture was, what do you build when you have everything except the thing you want? He wanted a place where being weak in a dynasty of strength wouldn't destroy you, where you could pursue knowledge and beauty without constant comparison to more powerful men, where your value wasn't measured in railroad miles or market dominance. He got what he wanted. For 20 years, Biltmore was exactly that place. George lived there, managed his forests, built his library, raised his daughter, existed apart from the world that made him feel inadequate. The house worked. The vision was real. But sustainability required conditions George couldn't control. It required that wars didn't come, that taxes didn't rise, that social attitudes toward great estates didn't shift, that he didn't die at 51, leaving his wife and daughter to manage an inheritance that was both fortune and burden. When those conditions changed, the house that was refuge became trap, a structure requiring hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to operate, a demonstration of wealth that exposed rather than protected, a vision that could only continue if someone kept paying the costs. Edith paid them as long as she could. When she couldn't anymore, she transformed the house into something that could pay for itself. She saved it by changing it. The alternative was losing it entirely. So what does Biltmore reveal? It reveals something about wealth and what it can create. George Vanderbilt built the largest private residence in American history. He employed the best architects, craftsmen, artists. He created something genuinely beautiful, culturally significant, architecturally important. Wealth made that possible. Without his fortune, none of it exists. It also reveals wealth's limits. Money created Biltmore. Money couldn't sustain it. The economic model failed. The vision required constant subsidy. When the subsidy stopped, the vision ended. And it reveals something about labor and who pays costs. George employed hundreds of people over the years, thousands if you count the construction workers who built the original house. They made the beauty possible. They maintained it. They performed the service that made luxury appear effortless. Their names, with only a few exceptions, have disappeared from the record. We know the architect's name. We know the landscape architect's name. We know George Vanderbilt's name. We don't know the names of most housemaids, footmen, cooks, groundskeepers, stable hands. We don't know what they actually thought about their employment. We know what they were paid. We know their work made the performance possible. Beyond that, history loses them. The house survived. The workers didn't, not in memory. That's not unique to Biltmore, that's universal. History preserves names attached to wealth and power. It loses names attached to service. Was George Vanderbilt a good employer?
By the standards of his era, probably yes. He paid reasonably, he maintained good working conditions, he wasn't a tyrant, but he operated within a system where his comfort required other people's labor, and those people had limited choices. That's not individual cruelty, that's systemic imbalance. The house is magnificent. The house was also a machine that consumed resources, human and material, at rates that required constant wealth flowing in. When the wealth flow stopped, the machine stopped. What survived was the structure, not the system. Biltmore is a mirror. What we see depends on how closely we look. From a distance, it's beautiful. Up close, the arithmetic that supported beauty becomes visible. The labor that created beauty becomes visible. The transformation required for survival becomes visible. The house George built to escape judgment became the most visible Vanderbilt property in America. It's the only one that survived as a complete structure. His brother's mansions in New York are mostly gone, demolished or converted. Biltmore endures because Edith was willing to commercialize it. George wanted privacy. What survived was complete transparency. Tours lead visitors through rooms George considered private, bedrooms where he slept, the library where he read, the breakfast room where his family ate. Nothing is hidden, everything is explained. The performance is complete, but it's a performance George never intended. Does that matter? The house is preserved. People visit and learn about Gilded Age architecture, craftsmanship, design. The forestry experiments George supported influenced American conservation policy. The house itself employs hundreds of people in the modern tourism industry. The survival has value. But it's worth asking, survival as what? Survival as a commercial enterprise selling access to the memory of private wealth. Survival as a tourist attraction demonstrating what money could buy in 1895. Survival as evidence of a vision that could not sustain itself. George built Biltmore to prove something, that beauty matters, that knowledge matters, that a life devoted to culture and learning and careful stewardship has value even in a world that primarily values power and profit. He proved it for 20 years. Then the proof failed, not because the values were wrong, but because the economic model supporting them collapsed.
The United States entered World War I in April 1917, 3 years after George's death. Edith, managing Biltmore alone, watched as the war reshaped everything. Young men from the estate and Biltmore village enlisted. Some never returned. The forestry operations, already scaled back after the land sale to the federal government, struggled with labor shortages. War production consumed resources. Coal prices increased sharply. Transportation costs rose. Everything required to operate a massive estate became more expensive precisely when Edith's income from investments was declining due to market uncertainty. The federal income tax, still new, ratcheted upward to fund the war effort. By 1918, the top marginal rate hit 77%. Edith's income from George's investments fell after taxes to a fraction of what George had available. The arithmetic was brutal. Costs up, income down. The gap widened monthly. She continued cutting. Staff levels dropped. Operations scaled back further. Wings of the house closed to save heating costs. The elaborate gardens maintained at reduced levels. The dairy and agricultural operations contracted. Everything that could be reduced was reduced. She also faced a new pressure, inheritance taxes. The federal estate tax, established in 1916, increased during the war. When George died in 1914, there was no federal estate tax. Had he died 2 years later, the tax burden would have been substantial. As it was, Edith avoided that particular crisis, but knew it was coming for the next generation. The 1920s brought temporary relief. The economy boomed. Stock markets surged. Edith's investments recovered. The estate's financial situation stabilized. Not comfortably, the operating costs still exceeded income, but manageably. She drew on capital when necessary, but no longer at crisis rates. Cornelia married in 1924. Her husband, John Cecil, was the younger son of a British lord, impeccable lineage, no money. The marriage was dynastic in the old sense, American money marrying European title. Cornelia brought wealth. John brought social position that the Vanderbilts still valued, despite being multiple generations into American aristocracy. They attempted to make Biltmore work as a family home.
2 sons born in the late 1920s, staff maintained at functional levels, some entertaining resumed. For a moment, it seemed possible that George's vision might continue into the second generation. Then came 1929. The stock market crashed in October. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment exploded. The Great Depression began. Edith's investments, like almost everyone's investments, lost value catastrophically. The income that had been merely insufficient became nearly non-existent. Property values collapsed. Edith couldn't sell land if she wanted to. There were no buyers at any reasonable price. The estate's assets were primarily land and the house itself. Both were illiquid in a collapsing economy. Operating costs couldn't be cut further without effectively abandoning the property. The minimum staff to prevent deterioration, the minimum maintenance to prevent decay, heat in winter to prevent pipes freezing. The baseline costs remained substantial even with everything pared to bone. The choice Edith faced in 1930 was final. Either liquidate immediately at depression prices, accepting massive losses, or find a way to make the estate generate revenue sufficient to sustain itself. Selling would mean losing everything George built, not just the house, but the vision, the forests, the collections, the careful design. All would be dispersed, probably destroyed. She chose preservation, and preservation required transformation.
Opening Biltmore to the public in 1930 was radical. The Vanderbilt mansions in New York occasionally opened for charity events, but those were temporary, controlled occasions. Opening Biltmore meant permanent public access, strangers walking through rooms George considered private, commercial transactions in a home built to escape commercialism. Edith hired staff to manage tourism operations, tour guides trained to lead groups through the public rooms, groundskeepers maintaining the approach and gardens to impress visitors, administrative staff handling reservations, tickets, publicity. The service staff now served tourists, not family. The house had to be recontextualized. What had been private residence became historic property. The entrance hall, which once welcomed family and invited guests, became a museum space. Velvet ropes guided traffic. Signs explained architectural features. Guides delivered scripted information about the tapestries, the paintings, the carved ceilings. Initial admission was $2 per person, roughly $35 in today's money. Tour groups were small at first. Word spread slowly. Local newspapers covered the opening. Regional tourism bureaus promoted Biltmore as an attraction. Gradually, visitors came. The tours told a specific story. The guides emphasized George's vision, his cultural sophistication, the architectural achievement. They showed the beauty. They explained the European inspirations. They quantified 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, numbers that demonstrated scale and impressed visitors. What the tours didn't emphasize, the financial crisis that forced the opening, the staff reductions, the transformation from private residence to commercial venture, the fundamental economic failure of the original model. The story was curated to preserve dignity while generating revenue. It worked partially. Tourism revenue helped, not enough to cover full operating costs. Edith and later Cornelia's sons still subsidized the estate from family capital, but enough to slow the decline, enough to make preservation possible. Cornelia and her husband moved to England in 1930, around the time the tours began. The timing wasn't coincidental. Living at Biltmore while strangers walked through unscheduled tours was uncomfortable. The house was no longer a home in the way George intended. It was a museum with some rooms where families still lived. Edith remained. She continued living at Biltmore for another 28 years, managing the estate, overseeing operations, maintaining standards even as circumstances eroded. She was 58 years old when the tours began. She was 87 when she died in 1958. She spent her final decades as something between owner and curator of her late husband's creation. World War II brought new challenges. Male staff enlisted or were drafted. Labor shortages again. Rationing affected operations. Tourism declined during wartime. People had neither money nor inclination for leisure travel. The estate struggled financially. Edith drew on capital reserves to cover costs, knowing those reserves were finite. After the war, tourism resumed.
The American middle class was expanding, car ownership increased, people had disposable income and sought entertainment. Historic homes became popular tourist destinations. Biltmore benefited from broader cultural trends toward heritage tourism. Admission prices increased gradually. Operations professionalized, marketing improved. By the 1950s, Biltmore was attracting tens of thousands of visitors annually. The revenue was significant, though still not enough to make the estate financially independent. When Edith died in 1958, control passed to her grandsons, George and William Cecil. They were in their early 30s. They inherited a property that was culturally significant, architecturally important, and financially challenged. The house required constant subsidies from family trusts established by earlier generations. They faced a choice: continue the model Edith established, maintaining Biltmore as a barely sustainable tourist attraction subsidized by family wealth, or fully commercialize, transform it from historic property with tourism to tourism enterprise with historic property. They chose full commercialization, and in making that choice, they ensured Biltmore's survival while completing its transformation.
The Cecil brothers, particularly William, developed Biltmore into a profitable enterprise. They expanded tourism capacity. They added amenities, a restaurant, then multiple restaurants, a gift shop, then multiple shops. They built a hotel on the estate grounds. They converted the dairy operations into a winery producing wine sold under the Biltmore brand. They increased admission prices to market rates. They marketed aggressively. They hosted events, weddings, corporate functions, Christmas celebrations. They turned the estate into a destination that people visited not just to see George Vanderbilt's house, but to experience multiple attractions on a single property. It worked commercially. By the 1980s, Biltmore was profitable. By the 1990s, it was highly profitable. Today, it attracts over 1 million visitors annually. Admission is roughly $75 per adult. The winery sells thousands of bottles. The restaurants serve thousands of meals. The shops sell millions in merchandise. The hotel accommodates thousands of overnight guests. The estate employs over 2,000 people in peak season, more staff than George ever employed, but serving different purposes, not maintaining a private residence, operating a tourism enterprise. The house itself is preserved impeccably. The Cecil family invested heavily in conservation and restoration. The tapestries are maintained by expert conservators. The paintings are climate-controlled and protected. The architectural details are repaired using period-appropriate methods. The house looks better now than it did in many periods of its history. The tours are educational. Guides explain the architecture, the history, the collections. They tell George's story. They describe the construction, the technology, the vision. They quantify the scale and cost. They contextualize Biltmore within the Gilded Age history. What the tours struggle to convey is the transformation itself. The story told to tourists is largely the story of George's vision and achievement, the house as he intended it, the beauty as he designed it. The financial crisis that forced the opening to tourists is mentioned but briefly as historical context that led to preservation rather than as the fundamental failure of the original model. The invisible labor is partially visible now. Tours mention the staff, describe their quarters in the basement, explain the bell system. But the emphasis is historical curiosity, look how people lived then, rather than examination of the power dynamics and economic exploitation that made the lifestyle possible.
The tours are not dishonest. They don't conceal facts, but they frame the story in ways that emphasize achievement and beauty over failure and cost. That's understandable. Tourists don't pay $75 to feel uncomfortable. They pay to admire, to learn, to experience something beautiful and impressive. But the house contains multiple stories. The story of George's vision, the story of the workers who built it, the story of the servants who maintained it, the story of Edith's desperate struggle to preserve it, the story of the commercial transformation that saved it. All true, all important, not all equally emphasized. What Biltmore is today is successful. It preserves George's architectural achievement. It employs thousands. It contributes to the regional economy. It educates visitors about Gilded Age history and architecture. It demonstrates that historic preservation can be financially sustainable if you're willing to fully commercialize. What it is not is what George built.
He built a private sanctuary where beauty and knowledge existed apart from commercial calculation. What survived is a commercial enterprise selling access to beauty and knowledge. The house endures, the vision does not. That's not a failure of the current management. They've done exactly what was necessary to ensure survival. They've balanced preservation with profitability. They've maintained quality while expanding capacity. They've turned what could have been a slowly deteriorating ruin into one of America's most successful historic properties. But it's worth acknowledging what was lost in that success. The privacy George sought, the refuge from public performance, the space where a different set of values could operate away from the market forces that dominated American life. Those things vanished because they couldn't pay for themselves. What survived was what could generate revenue. The house George built to escape the world became the most visited Vanderbilt property in America. The sanctuary became spectacle. The private became public. The transformation was necessary for physical preservation. It was also the end of George's actual vision. Buildings can outlast the purposes for which they're built. Cathedrals become museums. Palaces become government offices. Houses become hotels. The structure survives while the meaning changes. Biltmore is a nearly perfect example. The architecture preserved beautifully while the purpose transformed completely.
Return to the question. What do you build when you have everything except the thing you want? George Vanderbilt had wealth beyond most people's imagination. $10 million inherited directly, trust funds generating substantial ongoing income, access to his family's larger fortune and business empire. He could buy almost anything, go almost anywhere, command almost any service. He had everything money could buy in 1890s America. What he didn't have was power within his family, or confidence in his physical strength, or comfort in the social performance expected of wealthy men, or a role that felt meaningful rather than ornamental. He had resources. He lacked purpose that felt genuinely his. So he built Biltmore, a place where the values he cared about could matter more than the values that dominated his brother's worlds, where knowledge and beauty and careful stewardship defined success rather than market dominance or social conquest, where being physically fragile didn't mark you as weak because strength wasn't primarily physical. For 20 years, it worked. The vision was real. George lived the life he designed. He managed forests according to scientific principles. He built a library containing the knowledge he valued. He created beauty that would last centuries. He demonstrated that wealth could support culture, not just consumption. And then he died, and the vision died with him, because it required his specific interests and his continuous subsidy. Edith tried to continue it, but without George's passion for forestry and scholarship, Biltmore was just an expensive house. The vision was his. Without him, it became burden. So what does Biltmore reveal? It reveals that wealth can create magnificent things. The house is genuinely impressive, architecturally significant, beautifully executed, filled with important artworks and carefully chosen furnishings. Wealth made that possible. The craftsmanship required expert labor. The materials required global trade networks. The design required sophisticated architectural knowledge. None of it happens without money. But wealth couldn't make it sustainable. The house cost more to operate than it generated in value to anyone except George. His brothers wouldn't have built it. It didn't advance business interests. His neighbors wouldn't have built it. They lacked the resources. His descendants couldn't maintain it. They lacked both George's fortune and his specific passion for the project. The vision required one man's obsessive focus and substantial ongoing subsidy. When either element disappeared, the vision failed. What survived was the structure. What failed was the purpose. And it reveals something about labor and who builds beauty. The historical record preserves names attached to wealth and design. George Washington Vanderbilt II, Richard Morris Hunt, Frederick Law Olmsted. Those names appear in every history of Biltmore because they represented capital and vision and top-level execution. The stonemasons who carved the limestone? Mostly unnamed. The workers who hauled materials to the site? Anonymous. The housemaids who cleaned the rooms? Lost to history except in aggregate employment records. The cooks who prepared the meals?
the groundskeepers who maintained the gardens, the stable hands who tended the horses. We know their job categories. We rarely know their names.
They built the beauty with their hands. They maintained it with their bodies. Their labor made George's vision real. The house could not exist without them. History remembers them primarily in footnotes, if at all. That's not unique to Biltmore. That's how power and memory work. The people who command resources get remembered. The people who execute the commands largely don't. The architect's name survives. The carpenter's name fades. The owner's vision is preserved. The worker's contribution is acknowledged in aggregate, but not individually. Was George a good employer? By contemporary standards, apparently yes. He paid reasonably. He maintained safe conditions. He wasn't cruel, but he operated within a system where his comfort required other people's labor, and those people had limited choices about whether to provide it. That's not individual moral failing. That's structural imbalance. The house was magnificent. The house was also a machine requiring constant inputs, human labor, natural resources, capital, to produce outputs that benefited primarily one family. When the inputs became too expensive relative to George's resources, the machine stopped functioning as designed. Biltmore survived by transforming, by opening to tourists, by becoming entertainment rather than residence, by commodifying access to beauty rather than simply containing it privately. The commercialization saved the structure by abandoning the original purpose. Is that good? It preserved something genuinely significant. The architecture matters. The craftsmanship matters. The house educates visitors about Gilded Age America, about design and taste, and the material culture of wealth. Preservation has value. But what's preserved is evidence of the vision, not the vision itself. The house survives. George's intended use does not. Tourists walk through rooms George considered private. They photograph spaces designed for intimate family life. They consume the beauty George wanted to inhabit, not display. The transformation was necessary. Without commercialization, the house would have been sold, probably subdivided, possibly demolished. Most Gilded Age mansions suffered that fate. Biltmore survived because the family was willing to change its function completely. But survival as what? As a profitable tourism enterprise demonstrating what money could build in 1895? As a museum of private wealth now publicly accessible? As evidence that great houses can survive if you turn them into theme parks? That's not criticism of the current management. They've done remarkable work preserving the property and making it financially sustainable. They've balanced commercial success with respect for the historical significance. They've created jobs and contributed to the regional economy. But it's worth acknowledging the irony. George built Biltmore to escape public performance. What survived is permanent public performance. He built it to create private refuge. What survived is completely transparent to anyone who buys a ticket. He built it to demonstrate that values beyond profit could shape how wealth was used. What survived survives because it's profitable. The house is a mirror. What you see depends on how closely you look. From a distance, it's a beautiful historic property, well-maintained and educational. Up close, the transformation becomes visible. The original purpose versus the survival purpose, the private vision versus the public reality, the sustainable dream versus the commercial necessity. Buildings don't choose their purposes or their transformations. People do. George chose to build Biltmore according to his vision. Edith chose to preserve it by opening it to tourists. The Cecil brothers chose to fully commercialize it. Each choice was reasonable given the circumstances they faced. Each choice also moved further from George's original intention. Walk through Biltmore today. The entrance hall still rises 70 feet to that barrel-vaulted ceiling. The limestone walls still gleam. The oak staircase still curves upward with those carved acorns and forest motifs. The Flemish tapestries still hang where George placed them. Everything looks as it looked when guests arrived for that first Christmas in 1895. But listen to the silence. It's not the silence of occupancy. It's museum silence, preservation silence. The quiet of a house that's no longer lived in but carefully maintained for display.
The fires still burn in the fireplaces during winter, but they're decorative now, not functional. The kitchen equipment is preserved as historical artifact, not actively used. The bedrooms are roped off, beds made but never slept in. The house survives, the life does not. Current management tells visitors that Biltmore is a living museum. The winery operates, the restaurants serve meals, the hotel accommodates guests, the estate employs thousands. In that sense, life continues, but it's commercial life, not residential life. It's tourism life, not family life. It's performance of a different kind than George intended. The tours show the beauty. They explain the vision. They quantify the achievement. What they struggle to convey is the cost, not just the dollar cost. That's actually easy to explain. $5 to $6 million for construction, hundreds of thousands annually for operations. Those numbers impress visitors. The harder cost to convey is what George and his family paid that wasn't monetary. The isolation, the pressure to maintain something unsustainable, the transformation of refuge into burden, the final necessity of commercializing the most private spaces, the end of the vision in service of preserving the structure. And the cost others paid. The workers who built it paid with their bodies, injuries, exhaustion, dangerous conditions. The servants who maintained it paid with their time and labor and the power imbalance inherent in service. George's descendants paid with the burden of maintaining something that consumed resources without generating equivalent value. Edith paid with decades and struggle to preserve a vision that wasn't entirely hers. Was it worth it? That depends on what you value. If you value architectural achievement, yes, Biltmore is genuinely significant. If you value cultural preservation, yes, the house educates visitors about American history. If you value economic impact, yes, the estate contributes substantially to the regional economy. Benefit exists. It's real. Who paid? The workers who built it paid with their bodies, injuries, exhaustion, dangerous conditions. The servants who maintained it paid with their time and labor and the power imbalance inherent in service. George's descendants paid with the burden of maintaining something that consumed resources without generating equivalent value. Edith paid with decades of struggle to preserve a vision that wasn't entirely hers. Was it worth it? That depends on what you value. If you value architectural achievement, yes, Biltmore is genuinely significant. If you value cultural preservation, yes, the house educates visitors about American history. If you value economic impact, yes, the estate contributes substantially to the regional economy. Benefit exists. It's real.
If you value the original vision, George's sanctuary, his refuge, his space where different values could operate, then no, that vision failed. The house survives, but the purpose does not. The structure outlasted the meaning. Could it have been different? Probably not fundamentally. The economic model was unsustainable from the beginning. Annual costs exceeded income unless George continuously drew on capital. That works temporarily. Eventually, capital runs out or circumstances change. When George died young and the economy collapsed, the model failed immediately. Even if George had lived longer, even if the Depression hadn't come, the fundamental problem remained. Private houses consuming this level of resources depend on conditions, wealth, cheap labor, low taxes, stable markets that don't remain stable forever. When conditions shift, houses like Biltmore become impossible to maintain as originally intended. Most Gilded Age mansions were demolished. The Vanderbilt houses in New York are mostly gone. The great Newport estates are museums or universities or subdivided. Biltmore survived because the family was willing to commercialize completely. That was the price of survival. Commercial transformation in exchange for physical preservation. The question is not whether Biltmore should have survived. It should have. The architecture alone justifies preservation. The question is what we see when we look at it now. Do we see only beauty and achievement, or do we also see the system that made beauty possible, the labor, the extraction, the power imbalance, the ultimate unsustainability?
The house is evidence. Evidence of what wealth could create when concentrated and directed by sophisticated taste. Evidence of what that creation required in resources and labor. Evidence of what happened when the economic model failed. Evidence of how commercial transformation preserves structures while erasing purposes. Biltmore doesn't teach one lesson. It contains multiple lessons in tension. Wealth can create beauty. Beauty requires labor. Labor comes at cost. Cost eventually exceeds value for private purposes. Survival requires adaptation. Adaptation transforms meaning. The structure outlasts the vision. Stand in that entrance hall. The chandeliers still shine, the limestone still gleams, the tapestries still hang. Everything physical remains. What's absent is George's presence, Edith's struggle, the servant's invisible work, the crisis that forced transformation. The house contains those absences, but doesn't announce them. The tours have improved over the decades. They mention the staff now, show the basement quarters, explain the service system. They acknowledge the financial challenges. They contextualize George's vision within Gilded Age excess and inequality. The story told is more complete than it was in 1930.
But limitations remain. Tour guides have 20 minutes in each room. Visitors want to see beauty, not wrestle with moral complexity. The commercial imperative, keep people happy, encourage return visits, generate positive reviews, creates pressure toward emphasis on achievement rather than cost. That's understandable. That's probably necessary for the business model. But it means the full story is still partially hidden. The beauty is completely visible. The system that produced beauty is partially visible. The costs that system imposed are mentioned but not dwelt upon. The house is a mirror. Stand close enough and you see yourself reflected. Stand back and you see surface beauty. Choose your distance carefully and you see both, the beauty and the reflection, the achievement and the cost, the vision and the transformation. George Washington Vanderbilt II built the largest private residence in American history to prove something to himself, that he could create something meaningful, that beauty and knowledge mattered, that being the youngest, the weakest, the least essential Vanderbilt didn't mean being worthless. He proved it. The house stands, the beauty remains, the achievement is real. He also proved something he didn't intend, that private visions requiring this level of resources are unsustainable, that wealth can create but not necessarily maintain, that transformation is the price of survival, that houses outlast the lives lived in them and the meanings attached to them. Biltmore endures, the vision does not. The structure survives, the purpose transformed. What remains is magnificent. What remains is also evidence of failure. Not George's personal failure, but the failure of a model of private wealth and private grandeur that could not sustain itself beyond specific historical conditions. The ocean of time keeps pushing against the foundations. The house still stands, carefully maintained, beautifully preserved. How long it will stand depends on choices yet to be made. Whether those choices will honor George's vision or simply preserve the structure is a question each generation must answer. The past is not past. It's present in the stones and the tapestries and the carved ceilings. It's present in the choices made about what to show and what to emphasize. It's present in the silences, the names not mentioned, the costs not quantified, the power imbalances acknowledged briefly, then set aside. Walk that entrance hall, look up. Everything George placed there remains, perfectly preserved, available to anyone who buys a ticket. Everything except the privacy he sought, the refuge he needed, the meaning he intended. Those things vanished, the house survived, and time moves forward, patient, relentless, waiting to see what comes next.